Varys sat alone in the dimly lit chamber, the shadows cast across his face as his fingers gently traced the map of Westeros laid before him. His eyes, sharp and calculating, moved over the familiar borders of the Seven Kingdoms. A master of whispers, a manipulator in the shadows, he had always known how to bend the world to his will. But now, with the Iron Throne within his grasp, the game was his to lose. It was a quiet moment of reflection, something that had become rare in his life. Varys had never sought power for its own sake. His loyalty to the realm had always been unwavering, but that loyalty had never been directed toward a single ruler. Kings and queens rose and fell, but Varys understood one truth above all. The realm was a living, breathing entity, and it needed someone who could guide it with a steady hand. He had always known he could do better than those who sat on the throne. Now he would prove it. The last years had been chaotic. The war between the Lannisters, Starks, and Targaryens had ravaged the realm, leaving a broken and fractured kingdom in its wake. But amidst the destruction, Varys saw opportunity. It was not a new war that would save Westeros, but a subtle reordering of its power structures. Tyrion Lannister, his trusted ally, had long been his link to the Westerosi courts, and his insight into Cersei's weakness was invaluable. But it was not enough to defeat the chaos. It was time to reset the pieces on the board. "Your Grace," came the familiar voice of his trusted informant, the bald eunuch known only as the Spider's Hand. He had been Varys's eyes and ears for years, working in the shadows, gathering information from every corner of the Seven Kingdoms. His appearance was calm, almost serene, yet there was an underlying sharpness in his eyes that told Varys this man had seen too much in his lifetime to be anything but dangerous. "Have you heard from our little bird in Dorne?" Varys asked, his voice smooth, a reflection of his calm demeanor. The man nodded, stepping forward. "They are uneasy, my lord. With the death of Doran Martell, the lines of succession are unclear. There is tension among the Sand Snakes. The realm fears another war." Varys smirked, his fingers tapping lightly against the table. "Good. Let them fear, but we can use their fear to our advantage. Dorne will need a new ruler, one who can unify the splintered factions and prevent another uprising. And I have someone in mind." His eyes flickered toward the east, toward the lands beyond the Red Mountains. "A marriage to the right house. Someone with connections. We will use Dorne's instability to our benefit, but we must move carefully." The eunuch nodded, understanding the weight of the task. "And the North? What of the Stark children?" Varys's gaze hardened, his mind calculating the possibilities. The North had always been a wild card in the Game of Thrones. The Stark family, fractured by betrayal and tragedy, had been reduced to mere shadows of what they once were. But the North had always been resilient. He could not ignore them. "We have to be subtle. The North will never fall under the direct rule of a Southern king, not without bloodshed, but we can offer them something they value: stability. We'll play on their loyalty to the Starks and keep them close, but under our watchful eyes." Varys had learned long ago that in Westeros, power wasn't just about armies or gold. It was about information, perception, and the ability to manipulate those who held power. The great houses of Westeros were ruled by pride and tradition, but beneath those surfaces were individuals, each with their own ambitions, fears, and desires. Varys had spent his life learning their secrets, and now those secrets would become his tools. He stood from the table, his cloak flowing behind him, like the web he had so carefully spun. "It's time to act. The kingdom is on the verge of collapse, but in chaos there is opportunity. Let us make sure it is our opportunity, and not the fools who believe they sit on the throne." The eunuch bowed deeply. "As you command, my lord." With that, Varys turned away, a shadow in his own right, as silent and mysterious as the whispers that had brought him here. His plan was already in motion, but even he knew that the path forward would be anything but easy. There were forces at play that would not simply bend to his will. The Lannisters, with their influence over the Iron Throne, would not yield without a fight. Daenerys Targaryen, the mother of dragons, was making waves across the narrow sea, and in the streets of King's Landing the people whispered of rebellion. But Varys had never feared a fight. He had only feared being ignored. As he moved through the dark corridors of his hidden lair, the flickering of candles casting long shadows on the walls, Varys felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. But this was his moment. The Seven Kingdoms, so fractured, so weak, would not survive another reign of madness. They needed a steady hand, and Varys would be that hand. He would reshape Westeros, not through force or violence, but through strategy, diplomacy, and cunning. The corridors of the Red Keep were quieter than usual. The clattering of swords and the murmur of the court had faded into an eerie silence as Varys navigated the familiar halls. The Iron Throne still loomed, an unfeeling, sharp monument to ambition and violence. But for all its grandeur, the throne had never been Varys's true goal. His power had always come from the shadows, and that's where he intended to remain. Varys's fingers tapped rhythmically on the stone wall as he passed by servants and guards who barely noticed him. He was the master of whisperers, after all, who would suspect a man so unremarkable in appearance. His plump face, soft-spoken voice, and unassuming demeanor were his greatest advantages. He had learned long ago that people underestimated him, and that in turn made him all the more dangerous. He arrived at his destination, a secluded room deep within the Red Keep. Inside, his trusted ally and confidant, Tyrion Lannister, sat by a table, the flickering light of a nearby candle casting long shadows on his face. The dwarf looked weary, the weight of the crown on his shoulders clear in the sag of his posture, but his sharp, calculating eyes betrayed no sign of weakness. "Varys," Tyrion greeted him, his voice tinged with an edge of frustration. "What's this about? I know you've been moving pieces around the board, but I need answers. What is your plan?" Varys closed the door behind him, sealing them off from the prying ears of the keep. He crossed the room to stand beside Tyrion, his gaze turning toward the map that lay spread across the table. "The time for patience is over, my friend. It's time to act. Cersei is crumbling, and Daenerys is still too far away to pose a real threat for now. But the moment she lands in Westeros, the entire kingdom will be in chaos. We cannot allow that." Tyrion nodded slowly, taking in Varys's words. "So what do you propose? We'll need allies. The houses are divided. We can't just take the throne by force." Varys smiled, a thin, knowing smile. "I don't need to take it by force. I never have. The throne will fall into my lap, just as the people's loyalty will. The realm is desperate for leadership. We will give them that leadership in the form they crave." Tyrion raised an eyebrow, his interest piqued. "And how do we do that?" "First," Varys said, "we must continue to fracture the power of the Lannisters. Cersei's grasp on the throne is weak. She has no true allies, and the moment her sons are out of the picture, her house will crumble. We must find a way to weaken her further. That is where we start." Tyrion looked at him sharply, understanding dawning. "You're suggesting we set the stage for her downfall, drive her to make a mistake?" "Precisely," Varys responded. "But we need more than just Cersei's weaknesses. We need to manipulate the other houses, use their ambition and their fear to our advantage. The Tyrells in the Reach are already uneasy. If we can make them think that their position is under threat, we can push them toward our side." Tyrion leaned forward. "And what about the North? The Starks? They're not exactly friends of the crown." Varys's eyes glittered and he leaned in closer, speaking in a near whisper. "The North is a delicate matter, but if we offer them something that appeals to their pride, their loyalty to their blood, we can sway them. The Stark children still have power, even if it is largely symbolic now, but that power can be manipulated. In marriage, a promise of land, small offerings but enough to keep them in line. Tyrion rubbed his chin thoughtfully. And Dorne? Dorne is the key to uniting the South, Varys said, his voice taking on a note of conviction. Dorne is fractured, but they are also proud. If we can place a new prince on the throne, one of our choosing, then we can broker peace in the South. Dorne will be our ally. With their armies, we can march against any who oppose us. And what about Daenerys? Tyrion asked, his voice cautious. She's still out there, and she has dragons. If she lands and takes King's Landing, we could be in serious trouble. Daenerys is a threat, but not an immediate one, Varys replied. We'll buy time. We'll feed her confidence, make her believe that the people of Westeros are eager to welcome her. By the time she arrives, she'll have already made too many enemies. We'll have the support we need to ensure she never gets close to the throne. Tyrion let out a breath, the weight of the plan settling over him. You've thought this through, haven't you? Varys smiled, his eyes narrowing slightly. I've had a lifetime to think about it. Everything is already in motion, Tyrion. All we need is to pull the right strings. The two men stood in silence for a moment, the enormity of their task settling over them. But Varys was unfazed. He had always known that power could be seized not through violence, but through control, manipulation, and patience. The Game of Thrones was a long one, and Varys had no intention of losing. His mind worked quickly, processing the countless variables that lay ahead. He had already begun sending out his little birds, gathering information on the scattered houses. Of Westeros, he knew their secrets, he knew their fears, and he knew how to turn them to his advantage. The game was now fully set into motion, and Varys could feel the pieces shifting beneath him like a great tide. His hands were steady, his mind razor-sharp. He had spent years gathering information, but now it was time to use that information to influence the course of history. No more waiting, no more games of subtlety. His time had come. The first target was Cersei Lannister. She had always been volatile, driven by ambition, fear, and a deep, almost obsessive need to protect her children. But her power was tenuous. With Tommen dead and Joffrey's violent death still hanging over her like a shadow, Cersei's grip on the Iron Throne was slipping. Varys knew that her greatest weakness was her overconfidence, her belief that her enemies were either too divided or too frightened to move against her. She had no idea that she was already being outplayed. A message arrived for Varys, one of many his little birds sent each day, but this one was different. It came from an unlikely source, the Tyrells. Mace Tyrell, the head of House Tyrell, had long been a fool. He could barely manage his own house, let alone the political landscape of Westeros. But his daughter Margaery had been a different matter entirely. Clever, ambitious, and well-connected, Margaery had quickly realized that Cersei was no longer a friend to the Tyrells. Her heart was set on preserving her family's power, and Varys knew she would be a valuable ally. Varys leaned over the letter, carefully reading the contents. A marriage, an alliance, it was the perfect opening. The Tyrells would be a powerful force in the south, and if Varys played his cards right, they would soon be under his control. The next day, Varys met with Margaery in secret, away from prying eyes. The room was small, its stone walls thick and cold, but Margaery's beauty and grace filled the space with warmth. She was poised, as always, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of desperation that Varys recognized immediately. She had seen the writing on the wall. Cersei's time was running out, and Margaery was positioning herself for the future. She would not be content to sit idly by while the Lannisters crumbled. "Margaery," Varys greeted her, his voice smooth. "As always. It is good to see you. I trust you've been well?" She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I know what you want, Varys," she said, her voice low, tinged with a mix of caution and curiosity. "And I know what you want from me. But you should know that I am not without my own plans." Varys smiled, a subtle, almost imperceptible smile. "I would expect nothing less from you, Your Grace. But perhaps our plans can align. I believe we both seek a future in which House Tyrell is more than just a house of flowers. I can offer you that future." Margaery narrowed her eyes, studying him carefully. "And what would that future look like? You cannot promise me the Iron Throne. No one can." "No," Varys said quietly, "but I can offer you a throne of your own. You see, I understand the tides of power better than most. And I understand that for all Cersei's talk of loyalty and family, she is, in truth, her own worst enemy. We need to create an alliance, a marriage that will unite the Reach with the power of the crown, a match that will cement your place in the realm's future." Margaery's lips curled into a small, almost predatory smile. "A marriage, you say?" Varys nodded. "Yes, to someone who will stand with you, not against you. Someone who understands the need for power, but is too blinded by pride to claim it for himself." Margaery took a moment to consider. "And who might that be?" "Your future husband," Varys said, his eyes gleaming, "is the one who will be the true power behind the throne. A man who is ready to step out of the shadows and claim his destiny." Meanwhile, far to the north, Varys's web was tightening around the Starks. The North had always been a powerful force in Westeros, and while it had been weakened by the War of the Five Kings, the Starks still carried with them an undeniable sense of loyalty and pride. Varys knew that if he could gain their trust, he would have an invaluable ally in the North, one that could help him consolidate power in the South. But the Stark children were still reeling from their losses. Robb's death had shattered the North's sense of unity, and Sansa, once a naive girl, had been scarred by her experiences in King's Landing. It was Bran Stark, the youngest of the Stark children, who would be the key to the North. Varys had already sent his little birds northward to learn what they could about the boy's current status. He was no longer the innocent child who had once dreamed of becoming a knight. Bran had grown in ways Varys could not have predicted, and now he was a player in the Game of Thrones in his own right. Varys's next move was to gain Bran's trust, to offer him a future in which the North could thrive once more. The boy had been touched by the mystical forces of the Three-Eyed Raven, but Varys knew that even with such knowledge, Bran would need someone to guide him in the realm of politics. Varys's final play would be in the Riverlands, with the Tyrells. Behind him, he could now turn his attention to securing the loyalty of the Riverlords. Edmure Tully, the last living heir of House Tully, had been captured and imprisoned during the War of the Five Kings, but Varys saw in him an opportunity. Edmure was a pawn, but a useful one. With his release, Varys could create a rift between the Tullys and the Freys, ultimately putting the Riverlands under his control. Each move was calculated, each piece placed carefully on the board. Cersei would be dealt with, Margaery would be his ally, the Starks would be brought into the fold, and the Riverlands would fall into his grasp. It was a complex web, but Varys was a master of weaving. Varys stood on a balcony overlooking the bustling streets of King's Landing, the air heavy with the promise of change. Below, the people moved like ants, ignorant of the silent wars that raged above them, the quiet manipulations that shaped their world. But Varys was not ignorant of the coming storm. His spies, his little birds, had already informed him that Daenerys Targaryen was not idle. She was gathering strength, her dragons a terrifying symbol of her power, and her army of loyal followers only grew in size and strength. If she arrived in Westeros unopposed, her vision of the world would be disastrous. But Varys knew this was his time. He had played the game long enough, and now the moment was fast approaching. The challenge, however, was far from simple. Daenerys had already proven that she was no stranger to victory. She had taken cities in Essos, overthrown tyrants, and freed the oppressed. Her name was whispered with reverence across the narrow sea. To face her head-on would be suicidal. But Varys was no fool. He knew that direct confrontation wasn't necessary. He didn't need to defeat Daenerys. He just needed to neutralize her, to manipulate the factions around her, to turn them against her before she even touched the shores of Westeros. His little birds had told him of her ambitions, her dreams of liberating Westeros from the Lannisters, of taking the Iron Throne for herself. But Varys also knew that Daenerys' sense of justice could be her undoing. She would not be able to see the subtlety of the game. Her moral righteousness would blind her to the darker forces moving in the shadows. "Your Grace," came the familiar voice of Tyrion Lannister, interrupting his thoughts. "We need to talk." Varys turned, his expression unchanged. "Of course, my lord. Come in." Tyrion stepped forward, his brow furrowed with concern. "I've been speaking with the ship's captains, and they tell me that Daenerys is preparing to cross the narrow sea. She is closer than we think." Varys studied him for a moment before answering. "I know, and I have already begun making preparations." Tyrion's eyes widened slightly. "What preparations?" Varys smiled thinly. "There are always options, Tyrion, always a way to turn the tide. The moment Daenerys sets foot on Westerosi soil, the game will shift. But we need to be ready. The key to defeating her will not be through force, but through her own missteps. She will make mistakes, and we will be there to exploit them." Tyrion wasn't convinced. "I've seen her, Varys. She's not like the others. She won't be easily swayed." "I never said it would be easy," Varys replied. "But I have learned that no one is immune to manipulation, not even Daenerys. She is a woman of passion, driven by a sense of justice. It is precisely this that will make her vulnerable." Back in the Riverlands, Varys's machinations continued to unfold. Edmure Tully had been released from his prison, and although his return had been met with some suspicion, Varys's influence was already starting to take hold. The Tullys, once proud and independent, had been reduced to shadows of their former selves. Edmure had no true power anymore, but he did have his family name, and that was enough for Varys to work with. A carefully timed letter had been sent to the Riverlands, promising that Edmure would be placed in a position of power. The catch was simple. His loyalty would be to Varys and not to the Freys. Varys knew that the Freys were no longer as formidable as they had once been, their power in decline after the Red Wedding. The Tullys, with Varys's support, would be positioned to challenge the Freys' dominance in the Riverlands. In return, Varys would have a powerful ally in the north, one who could help him keep the region stable in the wake of the growing chaos. Varys's eyes gleamed with satisfaction as he watched the pieces fall into place. He was a master of the long game, and the board was shaping up just as he had planned. In King's Landing, however, the situation was more volatile than Varys had anticipated. Cersei Lannister, sensing her grip on power slipping, had become more desperate. She was lashing out, isolating herself from those who could have been allies. Her paranoia was growing, and Varys knew that if she wasn't careful, she would make a fatal mistake. Varys had long suspected that Cersei's downfall would be her pride and inability to see beyond her own ambitions. She had never understood the subtleties of power the way Varys did. Her mind was clouded by her hatred of her enemies, and she was losing allies by the day. Her relationship with Jaime had deteriorated further, and Varys knew that Jaime's loyalty would soon be in question. He had been a powerful tool, but only so long as Cersei held his affection. Once that faded, Jaime could become a valuable ally to Varys, or to anyone else who offered him a path to redemption. The Tyrells, too, were proving more difficult to control than Varys had anticipated. Margaery Tyrell, despite her ambition, was still cautious. Her father, Mace Tyrrell, was a fool, easily manipulated, but Margaery was smarter than her father. Varys had to be careful not to push too hard. Pushing too far too quickly could cause the Tyrells to pull back, and he couldn't afford to lose them just yet. They were a critical piece of the puzzle, and Varys would need to ensure that their loyalty remained intact. And then there was Daenerys. She had grown more powerful with every passing day. Her dragons, a constant reminder of the devastation she could bring to Westeros. Her army of Dothraki, unsullied and freed slaves, was formidable, and her reputation as a liberator of the oppressed had earned her the support of many across the narrow sea. But Varys was not afraid. He had faced threats before, and he knew how to outlast them. The key would be patience and manipulation. For now, he had to focus on keeping the other houses divided, keeping them too distracted with their own ambitions and fears to unite against him. Daenerys was coming, yes, but Varys was ready. The pieces were moving, and when the time was right, he would strike. He had always been the one to pull the strings. This time, he would simply make sure that the storm would come for everyone except him. The air in King's Landing grew heavy, thick with the anticipation of the coming storm. News of Daenerys Targaryen's ships crossing the narrow sea had reached the capital, sending ripples of anxiety through the city. The thought of dragons, actual dragons, returning to the world after centuries of silence terrified many. But it was not the dragons alone that concerned Varys. It was the woman who commanded them. Daenerys had always been a firebrand, driven by her desire to free the oppressed and make a better world. She had conquered cities, toppled tyrants, and earned the loyalty of the Dothraki, the Unsullied, and many others who saw her as the rightful queen. Varys had underestimated her at first, thinking her nothing more than a naive girl with a few powerful tools at her disposal. But now, with her power growing by the day, he realized that he might have miscalculated. Tyrion, too, seemed to sense the danger. The ever-pragmatic Lannister was no longer confident in the strategy Varys had laid out. "I don't need to tell you how dangerous she is, Varys," Tyrion said one evening as the two men sat in a quiet corner of the Red Keep. "I've seen her, heard her speak. She's not just another claimant to the throne. She believes in what she's doing. That makes her far more dangerous than Cersei." Varys listened carefully, his hands folded neatly before him. "I'm aware of her convictions, my lord, but it is exactly those convictions that will be her undoing. Daenerys Targaryen has no subtlety. She believes in righteousness, and that is the flaw I can exploit." Tyrion shook his head, clearly skeptical. "Righteousness might be a flaw, but it also inspires loyalty. And loyalty, Varys, is something you can't easily manipulate. She's already won the hearts of many. Once she lands in Westeros, it won't be just the Lannisters who stand against her. It'll be everyone who believes she is the key to freeing this kingdom from the madness that has gripped it for so long." Varys stood up, walking to the window that overlooked the city. "People are fickle, Tyrion. They will follow a leader. Yes, but they will only follow for so long. Once they realize Daenerys is no different from the rulers who came before her, once they see the cost of her revolution, they will turn on her." Tyrion, still concerned, rubbed his temples. "And if you're wrong," Varys turned, his expression steady but intense, "I've been right more times than I can count. But I am not so arrogant to think she will fall easily. We must move carefully." Across the narrow sea, Daenerys stood at the helm of her ship, her eyes fixed on the shores of Westeros. The wind whipped her silver hair around her face, and her expression was one of quiet determination. She was not the same girl who had fled across the narrow sea all those years ago. She was a queen now, an unstoppable force, and she had a vision for the world that no one, not even the ancient families of Westeros, could destroy. She had already taken Meereen, freed the slaves and defeated the masters. She had gathered armies, built alliances, and had done what many thought impossible. But now, her true test awaited her. Westeros was a land divided, filled with powerful families who had long held sway over the Iron Throne. And yet, Daenerys felt certain she was destined to rule it all. Her dragons were her strength, and her people were loyal. It would be enough. But the challenges were growing clearer by the day. Varys, she knew, was a master manipulator. He had worked behind the scenes for years, orchestrating the rise and fall of kings and queens. Daenerys could not afford to underestimate him. She would need to be careful, calculating. Varys was not an enemy who would strike at her directly. He would wait. And that made him even more dangerous. She turned to her advisor, Missandei, who had grown increasingly worried as they approached Westeros. "Do you think they will accept me?" Daenerys asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Missandei's face was calm, but her eyes were thoughtful. "They will either accept you or fear you, Your Grace. There is no middle ground, but you have the people's love, and with that, you can change everything." Daenerys smiled faintly. "That's what I hope." Back in King's Landing, Varys's carefully constructed web was beginning to fray. Word had come that Daenerys was not only landing, but had already begun rallying support from some of the more rebellious houses, including the Tyrells, who, despite Varys's best efforts, were beginning to lean toward her. The Tyrells had always been opportunistic, and Margaery, despite her ambitions, was beginning to see the Targaryen queen as the true hope for the future. Varys couldn't allow that to happen. If Daenerys gained the support of the Tyrells, it would be a fatal blow to his plans. Tyrion, ever the pragmatist, knew that they had little time to act. "Cersei's gone mad, Varys," he said one night, his tone grim. "She's losing everything, and now, with Daenerys coming, the Lannisters are weaker than ever. You need to move quickly before this entire game slips from your grasp." Varys gave a slow, thoughtful nod. "I know. But Cersei will make one final move before she is finished. And that move might give me the leverage I need." Cersei had indeed gone mad, but not in the way Varys had expected. Desperation had driven her to a reckless decision. She had sent for the last remaining Targaryen bastards in Westeros, children who carried the blood of Aerys Däku, and planned to use them as leverage in her fight to maintain the throne. If she could control the Targaryen legacy, she could rally support, perhaps even use them as bargaining chips to broker her survival. But it was a dangerous move, one that would only serve to weaken her. Varys knew this would be the breaking point. And for Cersei, she had overplayed her hand, and when the time came, he would use her desperation to turn the final pieces of the game in his favor. The stakes were higher than ever. Daenerys' ships were nearing the shores of Westeros, and various factions were making their final preparations. Varys was no longer just playing the game, he was fighting for control of the realm. His influence was being challenged on all sides, but he was not the type to fold under pressure. He had spent his entire life in the shadows, pulling strings, watching kings and queens rise and fall, and now he was ready to claim his prize. But the question remained: would Daenerys' passion for liberation blind her to the true game, or would she be the one who finally took the Iron Throne? The winds of change had swept across the narrow sea, and with it, Daenerys Targaryen's arrival in Westeros became a harsh reality for all those who had held power for so long. The shores of Dragonstone were now the epicenter of the revolution that was coming for the Seven Kingdoms. Her ships, vast and numerous, filled the horizon as the Targaryen queen, with her army and dragons, made her long-awaited return to Westeros. Varys stood in the shadows of the Red Keep, watching the events unfold from the safety of the capital. Despite the distance, he felt the storm approaching. The moment Daenerys set foot in Westeros, the entire balance of power would shift. The people would see her dragons, and they would remember the old tales of the Targaryens. Many would rally to her cause, either out of loyalty to the Targaryen name or fear of her power. This was the moment that would determine who would ultimately sit on the Iron Throne. But for Varys, this was also the moment where his control over the realm would either solidify or fall apart. He had worked for years, carefully placing his pieces on the board, and now the game had escalated into something far beyond his control. Daenerys' arrival had changed the rules. The question now was whether Varys could keep his position or whether the rising dragon would devour him as it had devoured so many others. In Dragonstone, Daenerys stood before her loyal advisors, her heart heavy with the weight of her responsibility. The air was thick with the tension of their impending conquest. Her dragons perched behind her, a reminder of the power at her disposal. But even with that power, she knew the game she was playing was fraught with danger. The Seven Kingdoms were not easily won, and her ideals would be tested. She had seen how quickly alliances could turn sour in Essos, and she knew that Westeros would be no different. "We have landed," Daenerys said, her voice firm but filled with resolve. "Now we must march. The people of Westeros need to see who I am. We must show them that we are not invaders, but liberators. We will offer them a choice, bend the knee or face the consequences." Tyrion, ever the voice of reason, spoke up. "Your Grace, we must be careful. The power structures here are more entrenched than you realize. You cannot simply demand loyalty. We will need to build alliances with the houses, convince them that your reign will bring peace, not further bloodshed." Daenerys' eyes flashed with impatience. "You speak of alliances, Tyrion, but my allies are those who will fight for me. I do not need lords and ladies who fear the throne. I need people who will stand with me." Tyrion hesitated but nodded. "Of course, Your Grace. But we must consider the consequences of angering too many powerful houses. The Tyrells, the Martells, the Starks, they all have power in different parts of the kingdom. If we alienate them, we risk more than just Cersei Lannister. We risk the entire realm." Daenerys clenched her fists. She knew Tyrion was right, but her vision was clear. She would take the throne. She would remake Westeros, and no one, not even Varys, would stand in her way. Back in King's Landing, Varys felt the shift in the air. The city had grown restless as whispers of Daenerys' arrival spread like wildfire. The people were already enamored with the idea of the Targaryen queen, especially now that she had come to free them from the Lannisters. Even the most loyal supporters of Cersei were starting to question their loyalty. The promise of dragons, freedom and a better world was a powerful lure. But Varys was no fool. He knew that loyalty was fragile. The people of Westeros might rally to Daenerys, but they would turn just as quickly when her promises proved impossible to keep. And Varys intended to be there when that moment came. He had already begun to work on his backup plans. His network of spies had gathered intelligence on Daenerys' movements, her alliances and her weaknesses. It was clear that she underestimated the political intricacies of Westeros. She had a dream of liberation, but she had yet to learn that the Seven Kingdoms would never bend to the will of a single ruler. Not without bloodshed, not without a price. Varys' first step was to ensure that the key houses, particularly those in the south, would remain hesitant to back Daenerys. The Tyrells, despite their outward loyalty to the crown, were already looking for an opportunity to switch sides. They saw Daenerys as a potential savior, but Varys knew how to turn their hopes into fear. A few carefully planted rumors, a well-timed whisper in the right ears, and the Tyrells would be reconsidering their options. The Tyrells needed stability, and Varys could offer them that. Daenerys, with her wild ambitions and dragons, could not. Meanwhile, in the north, the Stark children remained unpredictable. Jon Snow, the bastard son of Eddard Stark, was growing in prominence among the Northern lords. Varys had always known that the North would be a challenge. The Starks were proud and resilient, but they were also divided. With Daenerys on the horizon, Jon Snow could become a rallying point for those who did not trust a foreign queen. If Varys could somehow sway Jon to his side, the North would become a powerful ally in his bid for the throne. But the greatest threat to Varys's control was Cersei Lannister. Her madness, once a hidden flaw, was becoming a glaring weakness. Desperation was taking hold of her, and she was beginning to make moves that threatened not only her own rule, but the stability of the entire realm. She had already alienated many of the lords and ladies of Westeros with her ruthless actions, and now, with Daenerys landing on their shores, Cersei was willing to do anything to hold on to her power. Varys had underestimated her before, but he would not make that mistake again. Cersei was playing her final card, a desperate alliance with the Iron Bank of Braavos. She was willing to sell out her own people to secure loans and mercenaries in an attempt to hold on to the throne. It was a gamble, and one that could destabilize the entire kingdom. Varys knew that Cersei's time was running out, but he also knew that her fall could set off a chain reaction that would tear Westeros apart. The Seven Kingdoms were on the edge of a precipice, and Daenerys' arrival had only made the ground beneath them more unstable. The game was no longer about subtlety. Varys had played the long game, building alliances, breaking enemies, and manipulating the world from behind the scenes. But now, the time had come to make his move. Daenerys' dragons were a wild card that could not be ignored, and Cersei's madness had pushed her to the brink. Varys had no choice but to act. In the coming days, he would make a choice. Would he support Daenerys and risk becoming another pawn in her revolution, or would he manipulate the game in his favor and take the throne for himself? King's Landing was no longer the place of quiet plotting it once was. The streets hummed with tension as rumors of Daenerys Targaryen's arrival spread like wildfire. The people spoke of dragons, of a foreign queen who would liberate them from the tyrants who had ruled for so long. Varys could feel the shifting tides of power, and he knew that time was running out. Despite his carefully laid plans, the pieces on the board were beginning to slip out of his control. His network of spies, once so reliable, was now overwhelmed by the sheer chaos unfolding across Westeros. Cersei Lannister, though desperate, was still a formidable opponent. She had resorted to extreme measures, even consorting with the Iron Bank for loans that would ensure her survival for now. But Varys knew that her actions were hastening her downfall. Her willingness to sacrifice the very people she ruled over had made her enemies more determined than ever to see her go. Meanwhile, Daenerys Targaryen had not wasted any time. She had landed at Dragonstone and had already begun making alliances with the houses of the Reach, promising them a future of peace and prosperity under her rule. Her dragons were an undeniable force, and Varys knew that they would be both a symbol of power and a terrifying weapon that could easily turn the tide of any battle. She had no idea what she was getting herself into. Westeros was a different beast entirely. Power here was not easily given. It was seized, it was fought for, and it was often taken through blood. Varys's mind raced as he considered his options. He had worked for years to carefully manipulate the political landscape of Westeros, but now the game had taken a turn he hadn't anticipated. His carefully crafted alliances were beginning to fray. The Tyrells, ever opportunistic, had grown too close to Daenerys, convinced that she would be the one to bring peace to the realm. Margaery's ambition had led her to believe that supporting the Targaryen queen would secure her position, but Varys knew better. The Tyrells could not be trusted. Their loyalty would always be tied to their self-interest. The Starks, meanwhile, were still fractured. Jon Snow, with his newfound power in the north, was growing in influence, but his allegiance was not so easily bought. Varys had kept a careful eye on him. and he knew that Jon's loyalty would be to the north first and foremost. The Stark bastards had always been a symbol of resilience, but they could also be unpredictable. If Jon Snow decided to side with Daenerys, it would be a blow to Varys's plans. Across the narrow sea, Daenerys was learning the harsh lessons of Westeros. The Targaryen queen was unaccustomed to the subtleties of politics in the Seven Kingdoms. She was used to the loyalty of those she had freed in Essos, but here the game was more dangerous. Every word, every alliance, every promise she made could turn against her. She had no experience with the intrigues of Westeros, and the brutal realities of the Seven Kingdoms were starting to weigh on her. Tyrion, ever the pragmatist, had warned her about the political landscape, but Daenerys had little patience for his caution. "We will march on King's Landing and take what is rightfully mine," she had said, her voice filled with unshakable resolve. "We will not let anyone stand in our way." Tyrion had tried to reason with her. "Your Grace, we cannot simply take the throne by force. We need the support of the people, of the lords. They will not bow to you simply because you demand it." Daenerys's eyes had hardened. "I will not be like those who ruled before me. I will free the people of Westeros from their chains." Tyrion knew that her idealism was both her greatest strength and her biggest weakness. He had seen it before in others, those who believed that their cause was righteous and that it would carry them to victory. But the world was not so simple. Righteousness could blind a ruler to the realities of the game. It could lead them to make disastrous decisions. But Daenerys had no time for caution. She had already made her decision. She would liberate Westeros, and nothing would stop her. Back in King's Landing, Cersei was descending further into madness. The walls of the Red Keep felt like they were closing in on her. Her desperation had reached a fever pitch, and she had begun to lash out at those who had once been her allies. Her relationship with Jaime had deteriorated, and her paranoia had reached the point where she trusted no one, not even her own brother. Varys, ever the patient manipulator, had been keeping a close watch on Cersei. He had hoped that her self-destructive behavior would hasten her downfall, but he had not expected her to sink so low, so quickly. She was becoming reckless, and her decisions were becoming increasingly erratic. Her alliance with the Iron Bank was her last-ditch effort to secure her power, but it was a desperate gamble that could easily backfire. Varys knew that he could not let Cersei's madness destroy everything he had worked for. He had to act, and he had to act quickly. If Daenerys and Cersei were to collide in an all-out war, Westeros would be plunged into chaos. Varys needed to position himself in a way that would allow him to control the outcome, no matter which side emerged victorious. The time for waiting was over. Varys's influence was slipping, but he was not without options. He had always been a master of manipulation, and now, more than ever, he would need every trick he had learned over the years. He knew that alliances could be forged and broken in an instant, and he would have to move quickly to ensure that he remained the one who controlled the game. Daenerys's arrival had changed everything. She had brought with her the hope of a new world, but she had also brought chaos. The political landscape of Westeros was shifting rapidly, and Varys had to choose his next moves carefully. The Iron Throne was within reach, but so was the possibility of total destruction. Varys had spent his life in the shadows, pulling the strings, making others dance to his tune. But now, the strings were unraveling, and he had to decide whether he would be the one to control the chaos or whether he would be consumed by it. The Red Keep had never felt so tense. The air was thick with the weight of impending decisions, and even the ever-watchful guards seemed on edge. King's Landing was a powder keg, and the spark could come from anywhere. Varys stood in his chambers, his eyes staring out at the city below. The streets, usually alive with the sounds of merchants, soldiers, and civilians, now seemed quieter, more solemn. People whispered in fear, talking of the dragons, the foreign queen, and the war that was inevitable. The realm was at a crossroads. Daenerys's invasion was no longer a distant threat, it was imminent. Her forces were marching toward King's Landing, and her supporters had rallied behind her, believing that she was the liberator the realm had been waiting for. But Varys knew better. Power was not so easily given. Daenerys had her dragons, but she lacked the understanding of Westeros's true game. Her idealism would blind her, and once she took King's Landing, the cost of her conquest would become evident. The people would soon see that power was not a fairy tale, and she would not be able to save them all. But for Varys, this was no longer about saving Westeros or even manipulating Daenerys. This was about survival. He had played the game for so long, hidden in the shadows, pulling the strings, but now the game had come to him. Daenerys, Cersei, and the entire kingdom were hurtling toward a final reckoning, and Varys had no choice but to make a decision. His allegiance had always been to the realm, to the people, but that loyalty was quickly being tested. His choice would determine whether he would live or die, and whether Westeros would be left in the hands of those who would tear it apart. In Dragonstone, Daenerys paced back and forth, her resolve growing stronger with each passing day. The time for diplomacy had passed. Her forces were ready to march on King's Landing, and she would not be swayed. She had freed the slaves of Essos. She had toppled tyrants and brought justice to those who had been oppressed for centuries. And now she would do the same in Westeros. The Iron Throne was hers by right, and no one would stop her. Tyrion watched her closely, understanding the weight of her convictions, but also the dangers of her actions. "Your Grace," he said carefully, "we have the support of many lords and ladies, but the path to the throne will not be easy. The people of King's Landing are afraid. They are loyal to Cersei, and many of them will fight for her, even if they do not agree with her." Daenerys turned to face him, her expression fierce. "They will bow to me, or they will die. There is no other choice." Tyrion's brow furrowed in concern. "Ruling with fire may bring us victory, but it will also bring destruction. You cannot save everyone. Westeros will be left in ruins if we don't consider the long-term consequences." But Daenerys would not be swayed. She had seen the devastation of Westeros firsthand, the endless cycles of power and betrayal. She believed that only she could break that cycle, but she had not yet realized the full weight of the throne she sought. She would learn soon enough. In King's Landing, Cersei was fighting her own war, one of survival. Her insanity had only grown worse as the siege of the capital became inevitable. She had already burned bridges with her allies, and now, with Daenerys's forces marching closer, she found herself relying on her most desperate allies, the Iron Bank of Braavos. She had promised them gold and land in exchange for mercenaries and loans, but even that was not enough to save her now. Cersei had long believed that her cunning and ruthlessness were enough to keep her on the throne. But now she was surrounded by enemies on all sides. Her desperation had pushed her to take extreme measures, even as her relationship with Jaime had deteriorated. She had lost her mind, and with it, her grasp on power. But Varys knew that Cersei's madness could still be used to his advantage. She was a puppet now, and he knew how to pull the strings. He had already sent a message to her most loyal supporters, offering them a choice: abandon Cersei and join him, or face the consequences. In her desperation, Cersei had no idea how far Varys was willing to go to ensure his victory. As Daenerys's forces neared the capital, the last of the lords of Westeros began to make their decisions. The Tyrells, ever opportunistic, had already made their move. Margaery Tyrell, once a cautious player in the Game of Thrones, had thrown her lot in with Daenerys, hoping to secure her place at the Queen's side. Varys had expected this, but he had not anticipated how quickly the Tyrells would abandon their alliance with the Lannisters. The Martells, still smarting from the loss of Doran Martell, were divided. Some factions saw Daenerys as their salvation, while others remained loyal to the crown. Varys had worked to keep the Martells in line, playing on their desire for revenge and using their desire for power to fuel his own plans. But it was the North that Varys knew would be the deciding factor. Jon Snow had grown into a strong leader, a symbol of resistance against the tyranny of the Lannisters and possibly Daenerys. The North would not easily bend to anyone's will. Varys knew that if Jon Snow threw his weight behind Daenerys, it would tip the scales in her favor. But if Jon chose to side with Cersei or even with Varys, then the power in Westeros would shift once more. The night before the final march to King's Landing, Varys stood in the darkness, contemplating his next move. He had manipulated everyone in this game: Cersei, the Tyrells, the Starks, even Daenerys. He had played the long game, moved the pieces, and now he was at the precipice of his ultimate decision. If he sided with Daenerys, he would risk becoming nothing more than another puppet in her revolution. If he aligned with Cersei, he would be supporting a madwoman who would tear the realm apart. But if he betrayed them both, he might just secure the throne for himself, ensuring that the realm would fall under his careful control. The time for subtlety had passed. Varys knew that he could no longer remain in the shadows. His choices were stark: ally with Daenerys, stick with Cersei, or seize the throne for himself and shape the future of Westeros. The Iron Throne was within reach.